imagine. For a moment, that you're walking through the streets of London in the 17th century. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke, damp wool, and the river. You're suffering from a splitting headache, one that's been plaguing you for days, or perhaps it's a cough that just won't quit, a deep, rattling thing that scares you in the dead of night. You turn a corner and step into an apothecary. The air inside is different. It's a dense, almost tangible cloud of scents: dried lavender, sharp cloves, earthy valerian root, and something else, something you can't quite place. It's a scent that's dusty, ancient, and strangely sweet, like old paper and exotic resin behind the counter. The apothecary, a man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched on his nose, listens to your ailments. He nods gravely, then turns to a row of large ceramic jars. He doesn't reach for a bundle of herbs or a bottle of elixir. Instead, he takes a scoop from a jar labeled Mumia and grinds a dark, brittle substance in a mortar and pestle as he works. You catch a glimpse of what he's grinding. It's unmistakably the fragment of a human hand, desiccated and brown with age. This, he tells you, is the finest medicine. This, he says, will cure what ails you, and the most astonishing part of this entire scene. It's not a scene from a horror novel. It was, for hundreds of years, simply medicine. This is the story of how the sacred dead of an ancient civilization became a pantry staple for a continent, how Egyptian mummies went from being revered pharaohs and priests to being a powdered panacea, a miracle drug consumed by kings and commoners alike. It's a chapter of history that feels too bizarre to be true, a tale of medical cannibalism that Europe has largely chosen to forget. How on earth did we get here? How did the act of eating a long-dead person become not just acceptable, but recommended by the highest medical authorities of the day? The journey begins, as many strange things do, with a simple misunderstanding. It all starts with a single word. I'm Femi Fe. In ancient Persia, Mimi Fe was the word for bitumen, a naturally occurring asphalt or pitch. This black, sticky substance, which seeped from the earth in places like the Zagros Mountains, was a cornerstone of ancient medicine. Physicians like the Greek Dioscorides and the Roman Pliny the Elder wrote extensively about its healing properties. They claimed it could staunch bleeding, heal wounds, soothe sore throats, and treat a variety of internal ailments. For centuries, bitumen, or Memfemi Fe, was a highly prized medicinal commodity exported across the ancient world. Now, let's travel to Egypt. The ancient Egyptians, as we know, were masters of mummification. Their goal was to preserve the body for the afterlife, and they used a complex cocktail of substances to achieve this. One of the key ingredients, especially in later periods, was resin and pitch, used to coat the body and the linen wrappings. Over thousands of years, the bodies and their wrappings would become saturated with these black, tar-like substances. When Arab invaders conquered Egypt in the 7th century, they explored the ancient tombs and necropolises. Inside, they found countless preserved bodies, blackened and hardened with resin. Seeing this black substance, they called it by the only name they knew for medicinal pitch, Mfemi Fe. It was a fateful and catastrophic case of mistaken identity. They believed the valuable medicinal substance was not just Fe the mummies, but that it was the very essence of the mummies themselves. The logic, though flawed, began to spread. The first known translation of this idea into a medical text appears in the 10th century by a Persian doctor named Ibn al-Baytar. He described a substance found in the tombs of Egypt, a mixture of myrrh and allulose that had seeped into the skulls of the dead. He claimed it was superior to raw asphalt for treating everything from bruises to paralysis. The idea was planted. By the 12th century, European translators poring over these Arabic medical texts brought the concept west. Gerard of Cremona, a prolific translator in Toledo, Spain, rendered "Ang femi fe as Mumia," and the idea of mummy as medicine began to infect European thought. At first, the logic was that the substance Fay found in Fay the mummies was the medicine, but soon a bizarre leap occurred. If the preservative was good, then surely the thing it preserved, the ancient, almost mystical human body, was even better. The mummy itself became the drug. The thinking was that these bodies, having cheated time and decay, must possess a powerful life force, a vital energy that could be transferred to the living. They weren't just bodies, they were vessels of ancient magic and resilience. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, Mumia was a standard item in any respectable apothecary's inventory. It was prescribed for an astonishingly wide range of illnesses. Got a headache? A dash of powdered mummy? A stomach ulcer? A mummy? Based plaster, suffering from epilepsy, vertigo, or nausea? A tincture of Mumia was the answer. It was considered a powerful coagulant, so it was used to stop internal bleeding and even applied directly to wounds. Some physicians believed it could cure the plague. It was, in essence, the ultimate panacea. The great and the good were all taking it. King Francis I of France was said to carry a pouch of Mumia with him at all times, just in case of an accident. The philosopher Francis Bacon believed it was excellent for staunching blood. The famed Renaissance physician Paracelsus, often considered a father of modern medicine, was a huge proponent. He scoffed at the idea of using just the bitumen, arguing that the flesh and bone of a person who died a non-violent death, preserved in this way, held the true secret to healing. He believed the mummy's spirit, its astral body, remained within the flesh and could rejuvenate the sick. Of course, not all Mumia was created equal. The most prized, the absolute top-shelf product, was believed to come from the bodies of ancient pharaohs and nobles. These were bodies that had been meticulously preserved, bodies that had once held power and divinity. A lesser grade came from commoners. But as demand surged across Europe, a problem quickly emerged. There simply weren't enough genuine, ancient Egyptian mummies to go around. The tombs of Egypt, which had lain silent for millennia, became the site of a new and gruesome gold rush. A vast, dark, and highly profitable trade network sprang up. European merchants, primarily based in Alexandria and Cairo, would hire local villagers to plunder the ancient necropolises. Under the cover of darkness, teams of men would descend into the sacred burial grounds of Saqqara and Thebes, breaking into sealed tombs, desecrating sarcophagi, and hauling out any preserved bodies they could find. These were not archaeologists. They were grave robbers, pure and simple. They worked quickly, with little regard for the history they were destroying. Bodies were torn from their coffins, stripped of their precious amulets and jewels, and then sold by weight to the waiting merchants. The trade was brutal and dangerous. Descriptions from the time tell of horrific conditions, of men suffocating from the dust of ages and the stench of decay within the tombs. They fought over territory and prized finds. A 16th-century physician named Leonhard Fuchs lamented that it was nearly impossible to get good-quality Mumia because the tomb raiders were so careless, often just hacking off limbs and smashing the bodies to pieces for easier transport. But even this industrial-scale desecration couldn't keep up with Europe's insatiable appetite. And where there is high demand and low supply, another market inevitably appears, the counterfeit market. The creation of fake Mumia became a cottage industry in Egypt. Unscrupulous entrepreneurs would acquire fresh corpses, often the bodies of executed criminals, the destitute, the enslaved, or victims of plagues. They would then create their own mummies in a gruesome parody of the ancient rites. They'd disembowel the bodies, stuff them with bitumen and spices, bind them in linen, and then cure them, either by baking them in ovens or, more commonly, by simply leaving them to dry out under the scorching Egyptian sun. These fakes, known as Mumia coptica, were then sold to unsuspecting European merchants as genuine antiquities. A 16th-century French surgeon, Ambroise Parfait, was one of the first to expose this fraud. While in Egypt, he was taken to see the operation of a prominent dealer in counterfeit mummies. The dealer proudly showed Parfait his stock, admitting that he used the bodies of those who had died of disease. Parfait was horrified. He realized that not only was the practice of eating mummies based on a fallacy, but that people were consuming the diseased flesh of recently deceased individuals. He wrote, "It causes great pain in their stomachs, a foul-smelling breath, and a great vomiting." Parfait became one of the first influential medical voices to speak out against the use of Mumia, arguing that if it couldn't even help the Egyptians avoid death, how could it possibly help the living? Despite these warnings, the trade continued to boom for another 200 years. The demand was just too high. Mummies, both real and fake, were shipped to ports like Venice, Genoa, and Marseille, where they were auctioned off like spices or textiles. They would then be distributed to apothecaries across the continent, finding their way into the medicine cabinets of homes in Germany, England, France, and beyond. There was a strange sort of culinary connoisseurship around it. Some recipes called for specific body parts. The skull was thought to be particularly effective for head-related ailments. The fat of the mummy was rendered into ointments. It was mixed with wine, beer, or water, baked into confections, or turned into topical plasters. Imagine the conversation in a household. "Darling, I'm feeling a bit faint. Could you fetch the powdered priest from the pantry?" It sounds like satire, but it was reality. As the Age of Enlightenment dawned in the 18th century, the practice began to fall out of favor within the medical community. The rise of rationalism and the scientific method meant that doctors were starting to demand evidence, not just tradition. The old humoral theories of medicine, which Mumia was a part of, were being replaced by a more modern understanding of anatomy and pathology. The exposure of the widespread fraud also did immense damage to its reputation. People were realizing they were paying exorbitant prices for what was likely the dried-out corpse of a recently executed thief from Cairo by the end of the 18th century. Mumia had largely vanished from official pharmacopoeias. But just as its life as a medicine was ending, the mummy found a new and even stranger role in European culture. The age of medical cannibalism gave way to the age of macabre entertainment. This brings us to the Victorian era, a period defined by its peculiar mix of strict public morality and a deep, private fascination with the Gothic, the spiritual, and the macabre. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt at the turn of the 19th century had ignited a ferocious wave of Egyptomania across Europe. The deciphering of the Rosetta Stone unlocked the secrets of hieroglyphs, and suddenly ancient Egypt was not just a land of myth, but a real, tangible history that could be explored and possessed. Wealthy Europeans on their grand tour would travel to Egypt, and as a souvenir, they would buy a mummy. It was the ultimate status symbol, a piece of exotic, ancient history to display in your drawing room back in London or Paris. But what do you do with a mummy once you have it? You can't just leave it in the corner like a piece of furniture, and so the bizarre phenomenon of the mummy unwrapping party was born. These were high society events. Invitations would be sent out. Guests would arrive in their finest evening wear. Champagne would be served. And then, as the highlight of the evening, the host, often with the help of a surgeon or antiquarian, would proceed to publicly unwrap a 3000-year-old corpse in their living room. The mood was one of hushed, scientific curiosity mixed with morbid titillation. The surgeon Thomas Mummy Pettigrew was a master of the form, a veritable showman of the sepulchral. He would lecture on the history of the deceased as he carefully cut away the brittle, resin-soaked linens. The audience would lean in, gasping as the final layers were removed, to reveal the desiccated face of a person who had last breathed air during the reign of Rameses the Great. It was part science, part theatre, and part desecration. People would collect the linen wrappings as souvenirs. Sometimes the revealed body parts would be passed around for guests to inspect. These events perfectly capture the Victorian attitude towards the past. It was something to be conquered, catalogued, owned, and consumed, even if only with the eyes. The mummy was no longer a sacred vessel for the afterlife, nor was it a potent medicine. It had become a curiosity, an object for public spectacle, its dignity unraveled for the amusement of a dinner party. But the strange afterlife of the mummy doesn't even end there. It found its way into yet another facet of European life, the art world. For centuries, artists have sought the perfect pigments to capture the world around them. And for a time, one of the most sought-after pigments was a rich, translucent brown, known fittingly as mummy brown. The recipe was exactly what it sounds like. It was made by grinding up whole Egyptian mummies, both human and feline, and mixing the resulting powder with white pitch and myrrh. The resulting paint was prized for its transparency and rich, warm tone, perfect for shading, glazing, and capturing the subtle tones of human flesh. Artists from the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in the mid-negative 19th century were particularly fond of it. Painters like Edward Burne-Jones and Lawrence Alma Tadema used mummy brown in their masterpieces. Imagine the flesh tones of a beautiful romanticized maiden on canvas were quite literally rendered with the flesh of a long-dead Egyptian. The supply was so plentiful that one London colourman in 1964 claimed he could still satisfy his customers' orders for mummy brown. But he had run out of mummies. The practice only truly stopped when the artists themselves became aware of what they were painting with. There's a famous, though possibly embellished, story about Edward Burne-Jones. Upon discovering that his favourite tube of paint was made from actual human remains, he was so horrified that he grabbed his last tube, took it out into his garden, and gave it a formal burial, finally laying at least one small part of a mummy to rest. Other, more industrial uses have been rumoured, though they are harder to substantiate. Mark Twain, in his travelogue Faith, Innocents Abroad, Faye reported a popular story that mummies were so plentiful in Egypt that they were being used as fuel for locomotives. He wrote, with his typical dry wit, "The fuel they use for the locomotive is composed of mummies 3,000 years old, purchased by the ton or by the graveyard for that purpose. I shall not smoke a cigar on this road again." While this makes for a fantastic image, historians have largely debunked it. Mummy bones and resin-soaked linen would simply not be a very efficient fuel source compared to coal or wood. A similar, and equally dubious, claim arose in the early 20th century that an American paper magnate was importing mummies to use their linen wrappings as pulp for making brown paper. The story goes that a cholera outbreak was traced back to this mummy paper, ending the practice. Again, it is a tale that has been widely circulated, but lacks solid evidence. It seems more a reflection of our modern horror at the commodification of the human body than a historical fact. What these stories show, whether true or not, is how deeply the idea of the mummy as a raw material had penetrated the Western imagination, from medicine to party favor. From paint to fuel, the Egyptian dead were seen as a resource to be exploited in every conceivable way. So what brought this all to an end? The final decline was a slow process, a gradual shift in consciousness. The rise of modern archaeology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries played a huge role. Figures like Flinders, Petrie pioneered systematic, scientific excavation methods. They weren't treasure hunters, they were scholars trying to understand and preserve the past. The discovery of Tutankhamun's intact tomb in 1922 captivated the world and fostered a new sense of awe and respect for the sanctity of these ancient sites. The mummy was rehumanized. It was no longer just Mumia or a party prop. It was the remains of a specific person, a king, a queen, a priestess, with a name and a history. Ethical considerations, which had been almost non-existent for centuries, began to take hold. The idea of grinding up a human being for paint or medicine finally and rightly became repulsive. Today, we look back on this entire chapter of history with a sense of profound disbelief. How could people have believed this? How could they have participated in such a gruesome trade? It's easy to judge from our modern vantage point, armed with our knowledge of germs, chemistry, and human rights. But to understand it, we have to try to see the world as they did. It was a world where life was often short and brutal, where disease was a constant terror, and where medicine was a desperate grasping in the dark. In a world without antibiotics, where a simple infection could kill, the promise of a miracle cure, no matter how strange, was intoxicating. The belief in sympathetic magic, the idea that an object can transfer its properties to you, was deeply ingrained. If a mummy represented victory over decay, then consuming it was a logical, if gruesome, way to absorb that victory. The story of Mumia is a powerful, unsettling reminder of the human capacity for belief, our desperate fear of mortality, and the incredibly strange and winding paths that history can take. It's a story of how reverence can curdle into rapaciousness, and how the sacred can be transformed into a commodity. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own time. What beliefs do we hold today that will seem barbaric or ridiculous to future generations? What miracle cures peddled on the internet? What unquestioned traditions, what casual consumptions will be the subject of their disbelieving historical documentaries? The long, strange journey of the Egyptian mummy, from God king to medicine, to party favor, to paint, is finally over. They now rest behind museum glass, objects of scientific study and public wonder. We have, at last, stopped consuming them. And instead, we are left to consume the story. A story that is, in its own way, just as potent and far more lasting than any powdered dust in an apothecary's jar.